March 17, 1943. In a quiet, wood-paneled office in the heart of Berlin, an admiral held a report that seemed impossible. It was a single sheet of paper, a dry summary of raw intelligence from an ocean away, but its contents were more explosive than a 1,000-pound bomb. The report didn't describe a new superweapon, a secret army, or a coming invasion. It described a factory, an American factory in a place called Michigan that was projected to soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the fanatics who populated Adolf Hitler's inner circle, it was a joke, a piece of clumsy American propaganda so absurd it was laughable. But to the spies who risked their lives to gather the information, and to the sober analysts who understood its implications, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence written in numbers. It was the day they knew with chilling mathematical certainty that the war was lost. This is the story of the devastating truth that was too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe, and how the denial of a single catastrophic fact sealed the fate of the Third Reich. In the heart of the Nazi war machine, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an oddity. As head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was a man who lived and breathed cold, hard facts. Unlike the sycophants and ideologues who surrounded Hitler, Canaris was an old-school professional, a product of the German Imperial Navy. He was a career naval officer, a patriot from a different era, who saw the world not through the warped lens of National Socialist ideology, but through the clear, cold glass of strategic reality. His loyalty was to Germany, not to the party, and his solemn duty was to provide the unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly. His organization, the Abwehr, was a sprawling network of agents, analysts, and informants stretching across the globe, the eyes and ears of the German military. In the early years of the war, the Abwehr had been a key to Germany's blitzkrieg victories, delivering the crucial intelligence that allowed the Wehrmacht to outmaneuver and outsmart its opponents. But by early 1943, the mood in Berlin was changing. The war was no longer a series of triumphant victory parades. The disaster at Stalingrad, where an entire German army had been devoured, had been a brutal shock to the system. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was grinding back with terrifying, inexorable force. In North Africa, American and British forces were squeezing the life out of Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. The tide of the war was beginning to turn. And yet, at the very top, in the rarefied air of the Führer's headquarters, a dangerous, almost mystical sense of invincibility lingered. Hitler, holed up in his Wolf's Lair command post in East Prussia, was becoming ever more detached from the real world, surrounded by yes-men like Martin Bormann and Wilhelm Keitel, who filtered out bad news and fed his growing delusions. He had come to believe the German war effort was a matter of sheer will. The German soldier was racially superior. German science was unbeatable. Victory was a matter of destiny. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Admiral Canaris was about to pour a bucket of ice-cold water. He was a man who understood the grim, unforgiving arithmetic of modern war. He knew it wasn't just a clash of armies, but a collision of economies, a brutal equation of steel, oil, and aluminum. And from his perch at the center of a global intelligence web, he was starting to see numbers that terrified him. Numbers that suggested Germany wasn't just losing the production war. It was about to be buried by an industrial avalanche it couldn't even begin to imagine. The intelligence didn't arrive in a single dramatic flash. It was a slow, creeping dread, built from a dozen different sources over many months. It started as whispers, fragments of information picked up by German agents in neutral countries like Portugal and Switzerland. A businessman returning from the United States spoke of a factory in the American Midwest so vast it was said to have its own weather system. A diplomat in Washington reported on new government production targets that seemed to have an extra zero appended to them. A Swedish engineer sent a coded message about an aircraft assembly line that moved not with the patient pace of shipbuilding, but with the relentless speed of automobile manufacturing. Individually, these reports could be dismissed as American bravado, but as they flowed into the Abwehr's headquarters on Berlin's Tirpitzhofer, Canaris's analysts, the sober professionals of his economic intelligence branch, saw the terrifying pattern. They all told the same story. They all pointed to one specific place, a massive, brand-new industrial complex in Michigan called Willow Run. And they all made the same utterly ridiculous claim. The Ford Motor Company was applying the techniques of automobile mass production to the construction of the B-24 Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber. The stated goal was to eventually roll one completed bomber off the line, not one a day, not one every few hours, but one every single hour. To the German mind, steeped in a tradition of meticulous, craft-based engineering, this was simply impossible. A B-24 Liberator was a beast, an 18-ton behemoth of aluminum and steel with over 1.5 million individual parts, thousands of miles of wiring, and 4 complex, supercharged engines. German factories, the pride of European engineering, took weeks, sometimes months, to produce a comparable heavy bomber like the troubled Heinkel 177. The idea that the Americans, a nation mocked in Nazi propaganda as a chaotic, decadent, and racially mixed society, could build such a complex weapon in 60 minutes was not just unbelievable, it was insulting. It violated their entire understanding of industrial production. Canaris and his officers did the math. If the Americans could actually pull this off, one bomber an hour meant 24 a day, over 700 a month, from a single factory. At that very moment, the entire German aircraft industry was struggling to produce a fraction of that number in heavy bombers across all its plants. The spies confirmed the details. The information was vetted. Even Japanese naval attachés, Germany's own allies, were sending back panicked reports on American production numbers with a tone of sheer, unadulterated dread. The data was solid. But how could this be? How could a workforce of what the Nazis considered inferior people, women, African Americans, immigrants, achieve this industrial miracle? How could a messy, inefficient democracy mobilize with such terrifying, monolithic focus? In the Nazi worldview, industrial and military strength came from racial purity and authoritarian top-down control. America, in their eyes, had neither. Therefore, the reports had to be a lie. They had to be part of a massive, clever Allied deception campaign. The alternative was too horrible to consider. It meant the war was no longer a contest of soldiers, generals, or even tactics. It was a war of factories. And if this report from March 1943 was pointing to a real future, it meant Germany had already lost. As one of Canaris's own officers grimly concluded in a marginal note on the report, if these numbers are correct, then Germany has already lost the war. It is no longer a question of willpower. It is a question of mathematics. Henry Ford and his brilliant, ruthless production chief, Charles Cast Iron Charlie Sorensen, had made an arrogant promise to the U.S. government. They would build airplanes just like they built Model Ts. The old guard of the established aircraft industry scoffed. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," one executive from Consolidated Aircraft sneered. Ford and Sorensen, pioneers of the moving assembly line, proved them wrong. They deconstructed the complex B-24, a craft-built machine, into thousands of manageable subassemblies. Each worker was trained for a single, repetitive task. One person drilled the same set of holes over and over. Another riveted the same panel, shift after shift. This allowed the plant's apprentice school to churn out thousands of new, single-skilled workers every week. And who were these workers? They were a direct, living contradiction of Nazi ideology. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly a third were women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who left their homes to operate heavy rivet guns and welding torches. One of these women, a real-life worker named Rose Will Monroe, became a direct inspiration for the famous Rosie propaganda character. The workforce was a tapestry of America. Over 9% of the workers were African American. Another 3% were classified as disabled. All working side by side, 6 days a week, in relentless 24-hour shifts. This was the very mongrel society Hitler so often mocked in his speeches. And they were about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied belief. The early days were rough, a chaotic period of adjustment that earned the plant the derisive nickname Willow Run. But as 1943 rolled on, the great machine hit its stride. Raw aluminum, steel, and rubber flowed in one end, and out the other an 18-ton heavy bomber emerged, ready to fly. This wasn't propaganda. It was a new kind of warfare, a war of industrial might that was being waged with slide rules and time clocks. And America was unleashing a weapon the Third Reich had no answer for. While German scientists worked on futuristic rockets and jets, America was perfecting its most devastating weapon of all, the assembly line. Armed with this terrifying, mathematical truth, Admiral Canaris faced his biggest and most dangerous challenge, penetrating the ideological fortress that surrounded Adolf Hitler. It was a wall built of arrogance, dogma, and willful ignorance, and its chief architect was the second most powerful man in Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Goring was the head of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. A flamboyant, decorated World War I ace, he saw himself as the ultimate authority on air power. He was also profoundly corrupt, deeply egotistical, and increasingly detached from the realities of the war. More than anyone, Göring was responsible for creating and perpetuating the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings on Willow Run, Göring's reaction wasn't concern. It wasn't even skepticism. It was laughter. The reports were dismissed with a wave of his hand. Americans cannot build airplanes. They're very good at refrigerators and razor blades. And that wasn't just a throwaway line. It was the perfect, concise summary of the Nazi worldview. To them, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent, spoiled consumer society. They were a mongrel race, lacking the discipline, the martial spirit, and the racial purity of the German people. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce a complex heavy bomber was in Göring's mind simply impossible. He dismissed the reports as clumsy American propaganda, probably fed to the Abwehr's agents to frighten them. You can imagine how maddening this was for Canaris. He was presenting a mathematical certainty to a man living in a fantasy. He tried to press the issue. His agents had specifics: the mile-long assembly line, the specialized tools, the sheer capital investment from the Ford Motor Company. He wouldn't hear it. He and his inner circle had their own narrative, an article of faith. To question it wasn't just to question a military assessment. It was heresy. Plus, for Göring to accept Canaris's report would be a devastating, personal admission of failure. It would mean his own intelligence services had missed the most critical development of the entire war, and that his beloved Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies by an enemy he had promised was inferior. And so, the report went nowhere. It was buried under Göring's immense ego. The wall of denial stood firm. Canaris was left holding a truth that could save Germany, but with no one in power willing to listen. The next step was the final one, the most dangerous of all, to somehow get the information to the one man who mattered, the Führer himself. Presenting facts in the Führer's headquarters was a strange and dangerous business. Whether at the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps or the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere was oppressive and paranoid. Reality was whatever Adolf Hitler decreed it to be. Military briefings were less about strategy and more about reinforcing whatever the Führer wanted to believe that day. Into this theater of delusion, the cold, hard facts from Willow Run were a ticking bomb. Hitler's view of the United States was a bizarre mix of contempt for its culture and grudging respect for its sheer size. He saw it as a mongrel nation, crippled by racial impurity and controlled by Jewish financiers. When confronted with the production figures from the Abwehr, the projections of 1 bomber an hour, over 650 a month from a single plant, Hitler's reaction mirrored Göring's, but was laced with pure venom. This wasn't just strategy, it was a personal insult to his ideology. The numbers were inflated fantasies, he raged, Jewish propaganda. His own armaments minister, Albert Speer, a man who actually understood industrial production, would later admit in Allied interrogations that he knew if the Willow Run numbers were even half accurate, Germany was doomed. But to say that in Hitler's presence in 1943 would have been professional and likely literal suicide. So the great confrontation between fact and dogma never really happened. Dogma always won in the Third Reich. The Admiral's warning was not just ignored, it was seen as a symptom of defeatism. The men who brought the truth were now seen as weak, their patriotism questioned. In Hitler's mind, the war was a test of will and blood, not of logistics and production schedules. A single piece of paper, representing the dangerous work of dozens of spies, was brushed aside. It contained the most important strategic fact of the war. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing at an exponential rate that Germany could not hope to match. The decision was made not by a formal order, but by a stubborn, fanatical refusal to see. The truth was rejected. The spies were dismissed. The Admiral was silenced. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, the fate of millions was sealed. The consequences of that denial were inevitable. They came first as a distant rumble in the sky, then as a terrifying roar that filled the skies over the Reich. Believing their own hype about German superiority, the High Command made a series of disastrous mistakes. They continued to funnel precious resources into Hitler's pet projects, the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons.
The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, while technologically advanced, were strategically insignificant and consumed vast resources. The Messerschmitt-made 262 jet fighter was a revolution, but it arrived too late in too few numbers to make a difference. They didn't have time because the prophecy of Willow Run was coming true.
Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became a flood. The U.S. 8th Air Force began its relentless daylight bombing campaign, and at the heart of this campaign were the B-24 Liberators. The very planes that were rolling off the assembly line in Michigan were now blotting out the German sky. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out week-long assault on the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, many from Willow Run, pounded factories across Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its home turf and was systematically annihilated. German pilots, however brave or skilled, were simply overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. For every German fighter that went down, there was only a trickle of replacements. For every American plane lost, 10 more were already crossing the Atlantic. It was a brutal, industrial war of attrition, exactly what Canaris had foreseen. The German cities that Goring had once promised would never be bombed were being reduced to rubble. A Luftwaffe general, fed up with Göring's detachment from reality, wrote in his diary, "The Reichsmarschall lives in fantasy. Yesterday 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft." The B-24s that rolled out of the most enormous room in the history of man were now deconstructing the Third Reich piece by piece. They shattered factories, tore up railways, and obliterated the oil refineries at Ploesti. The German war machine, starved of fuel, began to grind to a halt. The unstoppable Wehrmacht was being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory its leaders had laughed at. So what happened to the man who tried to sound the alarm? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of telling the truth was steep. As the war turned decisively against Germany, his sober, factual warnings marked him as a man not to be trusted. In Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist sounded a lot like being a traitor. His rivals in the SS, particularly Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, saw the Abwehr as a nest of untrustworthy, old-world aristocrats who lacked true Nazi fervor. They spied on him, waiting for him to make a mistake. His accurate reports on American industry weren't just dismissed, they were seen as proof that Canaris himself was spreading enemy propaganda. He was trapped. To do his job honestly was to seem disloyal. But Canaris's opposition went deeper. Horrified by the SS atrocities on the Eastern Front, he began using the Abwehr to shield members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He secretly worked to keep Franco's Spain from formally joining the Axis, an act of high-level sabotage that cost Hitler dearly. The final blow came after the failed July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. The Gestapo's brutal investigation uncovered the vast network of opposition within the German establishment, and many trails led back to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries were found, revealing the true depth of his opposition to the regime. On April 9, 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the war, the order came directly from a vengeful Hitler. At Flossenburg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, stripped naked, was slowly and brutally strangled to death with piano wire. It was a humiliating end for the man who had seen the future with perfect, terrible clarity. He was murdered by the very regime he had tried to save from its own blindness. He delivered the message, and for his trouble, he was erased.
When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the final production numbers proved just how right Canaris had been. The report that landed on his desk in March 1943 wasn't just accurate, it was an understatement. The final tally for Willow Run was staggering. At its absolute peak in 1944, the plant was producing a B-24 Liberator not every hour, but every 63 minutes. By the time the last plane rolled off the line, Ford had built 6,972 complete B-24 Liberators and produced another 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Think about that. A single American factory had produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed during the whole war. It wasn't even close. Across all its factories, the United States produced over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. In total, from 1940 to 1945, the U.S. manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, in the same period, produced around 94,000 combat aircraft. The American industrialist William S. Knudsen said it best: "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." The German failure to believe this wasn't a failure of spying. German agents did their job. They got the intel. The failure was a failure of acceptance. It was a total cognitive collapse at the highest levels of the regime, an inability to process facts that contradicted a fanatical ideology. The Nazi leadership, blinded by their own propaganda about racial superiority, simply couldn't believe the numbers. They were defeated not by a secret weapon, but by simple arithmetic. They were buried by an avalanche of steel and aluminum, forged by the very people they disdained, men and women of all backgrounds, working together in a free society. The spies were right. The Admiral was right. March 17, 1943, was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and nobody in power was willing to listen. The story of Willow Run isn't just a cool World War II fact. It's a chilling look at how any government, any group, or even any one of us can be blinded by what we want to believe. The Third Reich wasn't defeated for a lack of information. It was defeated because its leaders chose to trust their prejudices over the facts. They built a worldview on the sands of racial mythology, and when the tide of mathematical reality came crashing in, the entire structure was washed away. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant dismissals of Hitler and Goring was a battle for the soul of the German war effort, a battle between evidence and fantasy. Fantasy won, and in doing so, doomed the entire enterprise. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands as a monument to the very things Nazism wanted to destroy: the power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that totalitarianism could never match. The factory floor was a microcosm of the Allied cause, a chaotic, inefficient, beautiful mess of humanity that, when united, achieved the impossible. And so the legacy of that day in March 1943 echoes through time. It's a stark reminder that the most formidable walls aren't made of brick and mortar, are the ones we build in our own mind.